All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to our December Ivy Talk, our last Ivy Talk of 2023. My name is Mariah Payne, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm in Charlottesville, Virginia. We just want to thank everyone as we listen to Dr. Teresa Leslie speak on Black agrarianism. And we really want to appreciate Dr. Leslie for speaking with us tonight. So let me begin by introducing her. Dr. Teresa E. Leslie is a scientist, community engagement specialist, and educator. In addition to her published research investigating the interaction and delicate balance between people, the environment, animals, and pathogens, Dr. Leslie has authored books and articles that examine the interrelationships between racism and classism, public/global health inequity, and sustainable community development in both national and international contexts. From 2007 to 2013, she worked as a postdoctorate fellow at the Naval Medical Research Center's Viral and Rickettsial Disease Department, Infectious Disease Directorate in Silver Spring, Maryland. Dr. Leslie worked for 8 years as director of the Eastern Caribbean Public Health Foundation and served for 5 years as president of the board of STANAPA, an environmental conservation organization. In both capacities, she advised public health and agricultural agencies. Recently, she served as the scientific and educational director of Baltimore Value, which stands for Vaccine Acceptance and Access, Live in Unity, Education, and Engagement at Johns Hopkins University. She currently serves as the director of public health research at Echo Ray, the senior education development specialist at Central Maryland AHEC, and a public health associate at the Center for Religion and the City at Morgan State University. Along with that, she is also a descendant at Riverview Farm. Mrs. Texie Mae Hawkins and Mr. Hugh Carr are her great-great-grandparents, and Virginia Carr is her great-grandmother. Before we begin, I want to mention just a few things. This will be recorded. We will be adding it to our website and to our YouTube. I also ask that everyone please stay muted during the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can either save them to the end or type them in the chat, and we'll go over them at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Teresa Leslie.
Thank you, Mariah, and thank you everyone for being here this evening, spending your Wednesday evening in an Ivy Talk. I think in my introduction, one of the things you notice is I have a vast amount of experience in public health, especially with infectious disease. But as I was on that journey, one of the things that I began to realize is something that's very critical to health is our food. And I was at a conference the other day for Black farmers. And one of the things that they said, it was amazing. A woman from the USDA said, every time you eat or get dressed, think of agriculture. And this has been a journey for me, kind of a long journey. I'm trying to put these ideas together because I really want to. I'm actually currently working on a book. This is part of my madness, what I'm going to present to you this evening. But I do want to say that a lot of what's presented, it's not just me who's done the research. There are people, some in the room, you know who you are without having to call people out, who have been very instrumental, encouraging me and providing me information that some of which I still need to follow up on. But balancing everything that you have to do as well as writing a book, it takes time. So I want to, I am the great granddaughter of Hugh Carr and Texie Mae Hawkins, and it's something that when I visit Ivy Creek, it's something that I'm proud of. It's something that it's a sacred space to me. But one thing that's also unique about Ivy Creek and now Ivy Creek and Riverview Farm is that it's two things. It's an African-American family that prospered as a result of purchasing land. It's also a nature preserve. And a lot of times when you talk to people, it's either agriculture or it's nature. And I think agrarianism unites these two concepts in a very beautiful way. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, Black agrarianism, because there's agrarianism. And as I've been doing a lot of research into agrarianism and actually love some of the stuff that I'm reading, the history of any population that has been marginalized is always unique and always has unique parts of it that tend to be not just different, but almost beautiful. And so what I've been trying to do is looking at these agrarians, and it's opened up a world to me that I'm not the only one who's interested in this. The idea of where our food comes from, especially after, not, I hate using the word after COVID, but after going through the experience of COVID, the prices of food, we realize that our food systems really need to be revolutionized, rethought. And I would actually use the word innovated, because I think that a lot of what was done, sometimes you need to take 2 steps back to take 1 step forward. And my 2 steps back just happened to lead me to my family's history. Okay, here we go. So we're starting, I'm actually coming to you from Baltimore, Maryland, not from Albemarle County, Virginia, but this is an origin for me. It's an origin of part of my family. So why Albemarle County? Well, and I want to start by saying that all history is important. And I don't think there'll be any arguments from the crowd here tonight. All history is important, and history must be inclusive. And that's making a statement these days, because some people, people don't want all histories to come out. But I think that when we explore all histories and we look at the interconnectedness of it, that is actually American history. So my family has origins in Albemarle County. As far as I know, in the absence of, let's say, genetic testing, this is where part should be of my family heritage originates. Of course, I have my father's side is from the Caribbean, and this is just my mother's paternal line. But there's also, and when you're talking about agrarianism, and this is what I say, I talk to a lot of people and they don't want to talk about, let's say, those old white men who owned slaves. But we have to look at people in their time. And Albemarle County is the historic home place of Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the prominent contributors to American agrarianism. And I think that's important to know. And it makes this topic of agrarianism even more interesting. So I'm very happy to be here talking to you tonight for people who are from the county. So I'll start with Thomas Jefferson, who defined 2 strands of agrarianism. He had democratic agrarianism and aristocratic agrarianism. So this is just going into the history of it. And I do talk fast, and I have a lot of slides and I want to get through it. So if you think I'm going too fast, just, shout out, slow down, please. So the 2 forms, aristocratic is the central protagonist is the gentleman farmer, who is educated, has enough leisure time to dedicate himself to developing in the arts, sciences, and politics. I mean, to a certain extent, that's a description of Thomas Jefferson. And then you have democratic agrarianism, which demands economic political equality and the value of individual independence. So you don't just have land, you work the land. And from the land, you get wealth and you get freedom. And in turn, this creates a foundation for national as well as local or community democracy. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. It's not just that we're talking about, let's say, an agrarian. You're talking about agrarian communities. And that's another part when we're thinking about, how can this be used for now, the present and the future. I think one of the things that we've noticed in this country is, well, everybody's always saying that we have to preserve our democracy. But part of the reason why our democracy is problematic is because there's been a breakdown of community. And one thing about agrarianism in the utopian sense is that in this agrarian environment, the community is very important. So as we know, for most of US history, the elite aristocratic form of agrarianism has been practiced. And that's why you have another group that would call it the agrarian myth, because it's something that never really happened. And to a certain extent, that might be true. Thomas Jefferson was an aristocratic agrarian, and he could spend his time being a farmer because he had enslaved laborers doing the work. I think that was very far. Everybody remembers the play Hamilton. There's like a part of the play where they say, the reason why you can, you're not really doing the work. So those are the differences between traditional, when we're thinking about traditional agrarianism, this aristocratic and this democratic form. So, and just talking about Thomas Jefferson owning slaves, this is very interesting to me because this is just a map showing where the concentration of the enslaved were in Virginia in 1820. And I got this map from another talk, but the arrow is pointing to Albemarle County. And I just, to me, this is where my great great grandfather and great great grandmother originated in this particular area. Although I don't think they were born in 1820, but their parents were around then. And then you can't even see this, but I just wanted to put it in for reference because I was talking to a group of history people, a lot of people who are interested in history. This is the same thing, just looking at 1860. So this is right, at the time of the Civil War. Now, this is actually quite interesting because it shows the Albemarle population between 1790 and 1860, and it really shows that African Americans were the majority. And there has always been a free Black population in Albemarle County. So that's just some background historical data that I wanted to run past you, just to show that, to a certain extent, we're talking about an aristocratic form of agrarianism from its foundation. The enforced labor or enforced enslavement of African Americans is anti-agrarian. Let's put it that way. So it's very easy to say, well, this is a myth. This isn't something that ever happened. But if you think of the utopia, it's something that we can strive for. So exactly what is agrarianism? You must be asking right now. And one of the things I do believe we cannot go back. I'm not advocating going back to anything. But I think that a lot of the issues of the, say, DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, can be approached through an agrarian framework. And I specifically chose this person because it shows urban agriculture. Right now, there's a revival of agriculture in urban spaces that are transforming urban spaces. So, a lot of agrarian discussion always focuses on the rural. And I'll get to that a little bit later as well. It's also approaches it, you can look at it from an urban perspective as well. So what I have, we talked about Jefferson, but then we're not in Jefferson's time. So what is modern agrarianism? And a lot of what I read, there's this issue of morality. And this has been very difficult for me because I've always been the person to say, to really leave the spiritual part out of it. But I've had to kind of reconnect to that spiritual essence. Because agrarianism is a set of values and beliefs and practices that, yes, are associated with agriculture and particularly landowning. But one of the pillars is these ethical habits and moral obligation based on the principles of justice. I think that is in the modern agrarian form. And then you have Wendell Berry, which I think probably a lot of people have heard about, but he describes an agrarian culture as a community culture, which I described before. And that's why when I talk about how does agrarianism how can it affect us today, it can help us really grow communities. And, coming to you from Baltimore, which is a city with a lot of challenges, I have been on farms in Baltimore where I see and feel the rebirth of communities in these green spaces. And this is based on a familiarity that can only grow upon the land. So that relationship with the land. And I think that is the environmental piece. When you're talking about morality, the morality is how you treat the land. Are you treating it in a fair way? Are you taking care? Are we being stewards of the land? So, and that includes an agricultural piece, which leads to your sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture or no-till agriculture, all these modern terms that they're using today, but it's really agrarianism. And I'm one who said, I'm the type of person that, I hear a lot of people using new terms, but they have no historical perspective. And I'm sure that that if you don't understand history, what are you doomed to repeat it? So let's not come up with new terms. Let's kind of look at what's been done and the positive that has been done and go from there. So it's a culture that protects the environment through small-scale sustainable agriculture. And here's what's interesting. I don't know, she recently passed away, but Bell Hooks. And she echoes Berry in this book, and she emphasizes the significance of land and development culture that supports moral and virtuous communities. I mean, and I'm not talking about morality in the sense of let's say a Victorian type of morality or virtue. I'm talking about morality and how we treat each other, how we speak to each other, how we respect each other. And to a certain extent, and I know it sounds like a fantasy, I know it sounds beautiful, but through this agrarian approach where not only each other, but how we respect the land, how we respect all living creatures. Because as you know, when you have green spaces, you have wildlife that comes, you have insects that come. So again, but it shouldn't be separated that agriculture is here and then environmentalism is here. Agrarianism brings these two concepts together. And it's important to know that one does not need, you don't have to be a farmer to be an agrarian, but you must be committed to the practices and policies that promote health and vitality of lands, creatures, and people together. So it's actually, again, it sounds like it's a very beautiful way. And I think that and I'll get to this later, when we look at how African Americans approach agriculture in the past, they represent the essence of this. So in this, I'm not going to read this slide, but this is just, when you look at the social thinkers, such as Rousseau, Tocqueville, Putnam's, John Stuart Mill, John Dewey, they all talked about local communities as the cornerstone of democracy. And when you look at, again, my experience on farms and talking to farmers, I've also interviewed a number of farmers. Their farms become hubs for the community where communities meet. So it's like this rebirth of community, because when you think about it, all politics is local. All politics starts on the local level. It starts on the community level. So that's why I put that slide there for some background information. Again, I write more about that, but I really don't want to get bogged down with theories of these social thinkers. So agrarians and nature, and I think this is very important, especially for, because Ivy Creek is a nature foundation originally. So they're distinguished by their commitment and work for the well-being of their communities, and practice things that we would say good things like fertile soil, clean water, green spaces, nutritious foods. And as you go down this list, I hope you can see how me as a public health person is drawn to agriculture, is drawn to agrarianism. Because these things here, when I look at some of the communities in Baltimore, these are the things that are needed, really. Everything here is needed. And abundant, especially like green spaces, there's a definite link between green spaces and mental health. Safe neighborhoods, living in a city which is, characterized, or that's what they promote. There's violence. How can this agrarian lifestyle where people have access to food, and when people have access to green spaces, and we improve the local food environment, how will that impact people? And I'll say this, I was talking to somebody earlier, because I was in the Netherlands. I go there I wouldn't say often, but sometimes. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's there, and he was like, one thing that they have in the Netherlands is there's food, people get food, and although there's a housing crisis right now, but they get housing. You're less likely to commit crime if you have those things. So how can we use these agrarian principles to kind of rebuild our cities that are really kind of, after the factories left, there are no jobs for people. How can we build an economy, let's say, based on agrarian principles? So again, this is now, according to bell hooks, if you want to talk more about what is Black agrarianism, for years, the influence of Black agrarians has been neglected, forgotten, and purposefully erased. So we tend to think about, those people who left the South because the South was so bad. But that's not really the whole story, is it? People stayed. People like Hugh Carr and Texie Mae Hawkins, they stayed in the South. The question is, why? These Black agrarians are the ancestors who gave Black folk the oppositional consciousness, a way to think about life that could enable one to have self-esteem, even amid harsh and brutal circumstances. And again, this is bell hooks. These aren't my words. They have a legacy of self-determination and hard work. Farming is hard work. I mean, it is. I mean, I garden and it's hard work. And through their actions challenged the racial stereotype, claiming that Blacks were lazy, unwilling to work, inferior, deviant, etc. Some stereotypes that continue today. And we can't deny that these stereotypes continue today. In my everyday interactions, I'll give you an example. There's this idea that all African Americans are diseased and poor. And I was sitting in some meetings in Baltimore City, 2 meetings back to back. So it's an hour meeting, 2 hours. And they were talking about diabetes among Black people. By the end of those 2 hours, I felt like I was going to die. So again, it's not, we can't characterize all people as the same. And really, when we look at the history of Black agrarians and we look at the history of African Americans in general, I don't understand where this stereotype comes from, but that's another story. So, Black agrarian thought is influenced by a history of slavery and institutional racism, and in Black accomplishments in building an abiding connection to the land. These are painful memories. And a lot of times when you're really trying to get young people into farming, the first thing they'll say is, well, I don't want to be a slave. But it's really not about that, because there's another narrative. And this is the relationship between labor and land use and Black farmers their contributions were so much a part of the development of the agriculture sector in the United States, which kind of shifted after World War II into the industrial system that we had today. Could talk about that for hours, but that's not the point of this conversation now. But it is, because when you're talking about agrarianism, you are talking about shifting. And I'm not saying getting rid of industrial agriculture, which is where, when you don't know where your food comes from, where everything is processed. You could read a book. There's a book by Michael Pollan called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And I mean, when I was reading it, I was really disgusted, because basically what he talks about is that they make a corn sludge basically and form that into food that's palatable. That's disgusting. I mean, I don't even want to eat a chip anymore. So, but the idea is that, and that came about after World War II. But enslaved African Americans craved land as a source of refuge, freedom, and power. And then after emancipation, they pursued the land as their compensations for generations of free labor. And this gave them, I underlined, the measure of social and economic independence, but also an idea of redemption. Forgiveness from sin, I think, and not their sin, the sin of the nation, and how they were treated. So much hope, really. The quest for land reflected larger desires to create sovereign Black communities beyond where they felt safe. That's what it did. Agrarianism provided a safe space where they could control the food system that they had. So, and I just want to say the images I have are kind of purposefully selected. W. Du Bois did write this book called Black Reconstruction in America. This isn't from Du Bois, but W. Du Bois also had a number of studies of Black farmers in the South, and talked about how Black farmers were the first, created a Black middle class. Just like anybody writing 100 years ago, there's some biases in some of his work. But so I just want to, there are people who have studied this, but it has been pushed to the side. And I think that, this Reconstruction period is very important. That's the time when Hugh Carr really started, and not just Hugh Carr, that's the thing, looking to buy land. And it's this period where you can really document the contributions of Black agrarianism. And I think that, not saying that it provides some type of insight and instruction when correcting past mistakes and abuses. I think the main thing here, and I'll touch on this throughout, is the idea that people are not victims. I think that's so important. They did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as they were liberating themselves. They were resistant. They were resilient. And I think that's such an important story to be told. And I think that when we're, a lot of in public health, a lot of the things that I see happening is, oh, people don't have food, give them free food. Oh, people don't have this, give them that. But that's just building dependence. It's not building the self-determination and the autonomy that these people built during the Reconstruction period. And I think that, it can be used to develop, regenerate. You could use these ideas into the future if you look at what specifically what Black agrarians were doing and the communities that formed around them. But, Reconstruction has been mired by kind of revisionists, and I'm not going to talk about that, but that it was a failure. And it wasn't a failure. It was limited because it was cut short. And the history behind that, again, I can't really get into that because of time. But it was, abruptly ended and replaced with Jim Crow, and that lasted between 1877 and the mid 60s, specifically in the southern and border states. But what I've learned is that, I'm originally from New York, so it's not that in these systems and structures operated in the North as well. So it's not the idea that everybody was suffering in the South, because that's not what you really see when you look at these Black agrarians, and the North was a place of freedom. That's not, as a matter of fact, when people went to the North, they kind of found the same roadblocks that they had in the South. So I think that's, it's like that urban rural. We really want to be cautious in looking at, because when I look at the life of Hugh Carr and how not only him, but others Hugh Carr interacted with his former owner. So I think that's just, and it's different. And I've had to sit and think about it and say, how do I describe this? Because it's something that we don't think about. So again, Reconstruction is an unfinished, I would say, revolution. If Reconstruction had continued, during Reconstruction, like other Americans, at that time, it was a more agricultural economy. And their outlook, there was a trend towards embracing the American democratic and industrial philosophy. It's really a lost opportunity, I would say, that it ended so soon. And Black agrarianism served to protect African Americans from the harsh realities of American society. And again, it's one of the most ideal, and that's I can't get into this whole ideal thing. And let me just say this, that we have traditional agrarianism, or, the idea that agrarianism kind of is the ideal and creates communities, and you have democracy that grows out of that. But we know that never really happened in this country, correct? Because even if you look at like white yeoman farmers, they were poor. A lot of them, if you look at some of the narratives, the WPA narratives, the descriptions of them of being poor they were dirt poor. So it never really happened. But then you have Black agrarianism, and I wouldn't just, I'm studying Black agrarianism, but you have these communities of people who were the targets of oppression, and they created something. So to me, if you want to study agrarianism, you have to study these populations that were fighting against the non-ideal society that was in existence at the time. It's among those populations that you find the utopia, even though it's not quite a utopia, but it's more utopian. So again, this is an image of Booker T. Washington. A lot of contrast is made between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. But when I look at the Hugh Carr, when I look at Conley Greer, when I look at Mary Carr, because their lives have been documented, they were living the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, and he was a powerhouse. And people like to make a rivalry between him and W.B. Du Bois, but Du Bois was much younger than Booker T. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia. W. Du Bois was born in New Barrington, Massachusetts, and was never a slave. So different generations. And then Booker T. Washington died in a car accident, and then he was gone. So I think, we need to relook. Again, a lot of the stuff that they say is maybe, not in tune with what we think today, but people are products of their time. So Black Farm, and he talked about working the land and buying land, and that's what people were doing. Black farmland ownership steadily increased in the late 1800s, hit an all-time national average in 1910, when 14% of all farm owners operators were Black Americans. And this is, the Reconstruction period and decades after, when they, freed slaves, accumulated 19 million acres of land. And during the Reconstruction period, Black landowners purchased as much as they could. It was like a scramble for land. So they believed in, if you think about that, was the American dream. And it shows you that, people don't want to say this anymore. But what is something that bonds us, brings us together as Americans? Because everybody's kind of like fighting each other and, I'm this and I'm that, and everybody has their own identity. But what does it mean to be American? I think that is something that has been driving my research. When I look back at this group of individuals, they were the most patriotic people. They really adhered to these American values of land ownership. So this is a picture of George Washington Carver, again, after the period of Reconstruction, but again, he was born enslaved as well. So this is this generation that really held on to farming. And I would say that George Washington Carver is the father of sustainability. So everybody, and again, we're not linking, we're not acknowledging these people and what they were doing. So farming was essential, and numerous, you had farming cooperatives that were established. You had land ownership, agricultural education, and while there was discrimination, these people were surviving, not only surviving, but flourishing sometimes. And these institutions met the basic needs and material needs of the community. They had these local food systems, and they were interested in maintaining the commons. And value was not associated with a market like it is now, but with the assumption that life itself is important. And that there we go with the morality, that life itself is important and that you have to respect life. And that's not just human life. There's life that's not human. There's plants, there are animals. So, and when you look at George Washington Carver, apparently he was a huge man, but he was so gentle, and kind of bonded with, found himself lost in nature. So why is this significant? Agrarians fought for the right to participate in the food system. And just think about it, when you own your food system, that's power. If you own your food, that's power. I was watching, believe it or not, C-SPAN, Sue. I was watching the congressional hearings for the Farm Bill, and they kept saying that food security is national security. Food security is national security. At this point, again, going back to my Baltimore example, this is you have communities in Baltimore where there's no grocery store, none. And public transportation is garbage also. But I think that, people can look back and say, oh, well, that's really bad. But what's happening there will come to your community eventually. So it's not just those neighborhoods that we don't like to go to, where they're suffering. Food security it's very fragile right now, and it's at its breaking point. And there's a movement to go back to local and regional food systems. So they use land as a strategy to move forward towards freedom through the development of, again, these self-reliant and self-determined communities. Again, I mentioned it's a sense of resilience, strength and resilience. And, when you look at like the community that existed around Riverview Farm, it was an artisanal community where you had different craftsmen, you had different types of people. And again, you have to kind of weave these lives together. And it's not always easy to do. But I think when you look at the historical record, when you look at other things, other books and documents that have been written about these communities, we can kind of make the assumption that a lot of these people in this community that Hugh Carr lived were kind of doing the same things. And, when we create a space for voter registration, neighborhood and community betterness, again, there's the food access and this civic engagement, which is something that's kind of dying right now. It's just me that happens to be on a million boards, but most people, when you ask them to be on a board or do something, civic, they don't want to do it. Oh, I'm not getting paid for that, so I don't have time for that. It's not about necessarily always getting paid. It's about, again, bettering where you live, bettering your environment. So the communities acted not only to improve their own resources and circumstances, but to advance broader political and activist agendas that challenge these oppressive structures. And maybe they didn't do it maybe they weren't out there protesting, but you're talking about people who in their everyday lives did this, in their everyday actions did this. So why is it important to study these Black agrarianism? Because I think it's a true expression of the values associated with the American agrarian tradition. I think that if you look at agrarianism from just, the general viewpoint, it never existed. But if you look at these African American communities, I think you could see the benefits. I think you can see the building blocks for an agrarian future. And this does not mean that we're going to go, but this is when you're talking about greening our cities, incorporating agriculture into cities so we can buy local food. I think that's what it's not like I'm talking, again, going back to, get rid of cities, everybody move back to the country. That's not going to happen. But I think there's something to be learned. It is the ideal because it supported communities and sought justice and fairness, which is the point of agrarianism. So let's go on to the individual example of Hugh Carr. And again, this is kind of general knowledge, Ivy Creek people, but we know that Hugh Carr was officially emancipated when he was about 25 to 28 years of age. It's interesting, he's documented as never being taught to read or write, which is possible. But then I was reading this article about literacy, and anyway, I'm not going to get into that. There's no way to tell. That's my thing. If I can tell, I can, think about this and think about the other thing, but he's documented as never being taught to read or write. But he was so intelligent and had a great deal of foresight. And I think that we can see from what he built that he was very methodological in his approach. And his family, remember, you have the individual, you have the family, and then you have the community. So we haven't talked about the family, but the family remained close to each other following emancipation. And I think I haven't had a chance to really, eventually they spread out. But the family structure, I think, was very important. And I think, based on all the reading I did or have done, it's no doubt that not only Hugh Carr, but most people, as we discussed before, it was a route to independence and freedom. And, he collaborated interracially. When I talked about he worked with his former plantation owner, a lot of the land that they bought were owned by former plantation owners. But I don't think this collaboration should be defined as synonymous with equality. I think it was very complex. And I think that you would have had to have tread very cautiously. And that's just, I think, when we're talking about the time, I think some people may have had a lot of respect for Hugh Carr, but Hugh Carr was still African American. And he used his ability, which had been exploited in the past. And 5 years after emancipation, he began making payments towards the purchase of a 58-acre property. And I'm not going to get into, that's all there on the website if you want to get into exactly when he bought land and how much land he bought. I'm thinking more general for this presentation, that looking at Hugh Carr and looking at the other things that I've read about agrarianism and land ownership, it's not just Hugh Carr. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. He's an individual example, but he's by no means the only person who did this. So in 1880, he built a house. He had enough money to build a home on his land. Imagine what that would have felt like. And he was operating a very diverse farm. And I'm not going to read all of that because I don't want to run out of time. Wow. So again, a very diverse farm. And then, soon after he builds his house, he marries Texie Mae Hawkins. in 1884. Now, he was married before. Again, that's another part that I just didn't have time to really talk about today. And they have 7 children. Um, and my great grandmother was the second to youngest, Blanche, Virginia. And again, I'm not going to get into all the children. So let's just talk a little bit about the community because we've been talking about it. So they were not in isolation. That's the important thing. They were part of a larger community. And I think this community, again, let's just put it this way. There were many Black Wall Streets. A lot of people like to talk about Black Wall Street like it's the only place. But there were multiple Black Wall Streets that sprung up all over the place at this time. And I just say this, if they could do it then, we could do something now. So I think, again, it illustrates that these African-American communities that grew up out of these agrarian, in these agrarian African-American communities. I've kind of mentioned this before. They became agents in their own lives. And again, it's all about, everybody wants to have control over what you do and your life. And being able to, it's not just Hugh Carr, he was probably one of the richest Black landowners in Albemarle County at the time, but people had smaller farms. People were doing things, and that gave them a sense of a positive sense of themselves, which is missing from a lot of people. And again, going back to some of the research that I've done on farms, especially with children, when you see these youth engaging in farming and what they learn about food and nutrition, there's so much to unpack here about the benefits of an agrarian lifestyle. And again, it's about and that's why I decided to talk to Black farmers, because I want to hear their stories. Hugh Carr is just one story. And I think that within this agrarian perspective, his story needs to be told. So again, at the bottom, I say families create strong communities, offering solidarity, spiritual comfort, and alternative access to goods and services, which are not in control at this point from the white population. And I noticed that happening, like when you have governments that don't seem to be doing, and I'm talking about my local government, not Charlottesville's local government, that doesn't seem to be doing what they need to do for the population through food, through farms, urban farms in Baltimore. They're doing it themselves. It's the most amazing thing to see. So there is a rebirth of this kind of agrarian spirit. And this is just interesting. Again, this has made, I put the picture of the church there because I think that's very important. Religion was very much a part of these communities as well as education, although I'm talking about the land here. But in addition to buying land, part of community building would be to establish schools, which we did, which were done. And again, that goes into the history of Mary Carr Greer. And then you had, in these particular neighborhoods, you had about 60 Black landowners. A lot were small, but there were other bigger ones. And then there's this concept of beloved community. So this is another concept that I'm developing. I'm not developing it, it's already out there, but really trying to link this idea of Black agrarianism. We've talked about that with community, but a step beyond that is the idea of a beloved community, which is thrown around there all the time now. But one of the most important things, and I don't discuss it here, with beloved communities is it has to go along with a beloved economy. And within these agrarian communities, you had that beloved economy, which is based on abundance and not scarcity. So, and there are these two authors that Jones and Burrow, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about happened long after Reconstruction. But according to these authors, Blacks have been searching for the beloved community for as long as they have been in this country. And the phrase was first used by the philosopher, theologian, Josiah Royce. And that's why I'm saying this has been very difficult for me to do, because I have not been somebody who's been into theology. And I've had to kind of enter things that I never thought I would enter before. But it was further developed by Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King popularized it. So that's a picture of Howard Thurman, actually. And you could really see how Thurman and King linked into these ideas, because there was this concept of loving loyalty, devotion, sacrifice to a person or a cause. And the loyalty leads to community building and search for common ground, and rooted in the relationship of the individual to their social existence. So what was the social existence, of these communities and African Americans throughout history? And for Thurman and King, of course, this vision was really nurtured in the Black church tradition. Going back to the last slide where I showed the church, the churches were foundational in these communities as well. I think one of the individuals that began the church was a woodfolk in Hydraulic Mills, Union Ridge, and founding the church right there. You know where it is. Again, I'm not from Charlottesville, but I always drive by that area to see it when I'm there. So the idea of universal liberation of all people and the fundamental themes of, again, this redemption, forgiveness, reconciliation, and hope. A commitment to empathy with all oppressed and divine dissatisfaction with injustice, I think, is fundamental to the beloved community. And that's why it goes back to that Blacks have been searching for this beloved community forever. So during the Reconstruction period, the cause was empowerment, a movement towards autonomy, something I've been mentioning before, self-determination within this harsh racial environment. And from this, we could talk about Black Wall Street, but we can also talk about these beloved communities formed. And people within communities were loyal to one another as their fates were tied together. So, and there are a few instances where people kind of got together. So Hugh Carr, Berkeley Bullock, Rollin Sammons, Moses Gillette, Tinsley Woodfolk, and Albert Wheeler, they were doing something, purchasing land together. They collaborated. I think that's and that it shows that it wasn't just for them. They knew they needed each other, so they had to work cooperatively. And I think that, again, Du Bois did a lot of work on Black cooperatives as well. So this was something that was common at that time. And again, they also worked with white people. They had no other choice. That's who owned the land. And as you can see in this picture, all these people kind of lived together. They were like, they had plots of land next to each other. And I know there are some descendants of some of these people on the call today. So, but they really worked together to build these communities. So these are some notables in the community. And it's interesting that we were just talking about, when we're talking about Riverview Farms, we really should be talking about the community. So you had Rollin Sammons and Sarah Bell Scott Sammons. Now, sometimes I've tried to list the wives and not just the men, because I think it's also important to kind of look at the things that women were doing as well, especially since, 6 of the 7 children of Hugh Carr and Texie Mae Hawkins were women, and powerful women. Then you have Berkeley Bullock. I think most people, but then I found this guy, William Brown and Caroline Green Brown. They didn't stay there, but they were involved in a few land deals. Albert Wheeler, of course, Tinsley Woodfolk and Letitia Allen, Moses Gillette, Jesse Sammons, and his wife, Lula Minor Gibbons, and Reeves Minor. So these are some people, these are some powerful people. I mean, we know Rollin Sammons was born free, or he was free, and he owned the hydraulic mill. Berkeley Bullock was an entrepreneur. So was William Brown. If I'm not mistaken, Albert Wheeler was, what do you call it? I can't remember. It's a trade. I can't, blacksmith, I think. And then, of course, Woodfolk and Minor kind of started the church. Moses Gillette was a former slave at Monticello, and Jesse Sammons was Rollin Sammons' son. And if you look, Sarah Bell Scott Sammons, I think was related, that's Rollin Sammons' wife, was related to, it's evening time and my brain shuts off in the evening time, Sally Hemings. So then you have, after the lives of, and this is where it gets, again, I'm kind of getting into this part of the research. migration. So, for example, my great grandmother, Virginia, left. She was born in 1893. Her mother dies. I'm sorry, that should be 1899. Sorry. You go over PowerPoints forever and then you don't see the mistakes until you're actually doing it. And in 1910, she was living at home 16. Her father dies in 1914. And then she ends up in Plainfield, New Jersey. And this was, I can't explain this. I can, yes. She's living with Julia Mackenzie, whose Jewish maiden name, Julia Stricker Coles, who's a major family in Charlottesville, the Stricker Coles. So I'm like, how did Virginia end up in this household where she was working as a dressmaker? Shows you the relationship between people that you wouldn't think had a relationship. The bottom line is nobody's going to send a 16, 21-year-old someplace without a network. So these people were part of her network or part of the family's network. There was also a relative of Salmon's who was also living in Jersey City. So there seems to have been a route of migration to this part of really Plainfield, New Jersey. And Virginia marries Maxwell Brown in 1915, married, whatever. But the tragic thing, and I think she dies Christmas Eve in 1935. And I think that always caused trauma for my grandfather, leading to him not to really talk about it. So I think that, but there are bits and pieces. So her life, there is evidence that she was involved with the NAACP. But again, I have to get to New Jersey to try and dig up more on her. But I just think it's very interesting that, when I saw that find of the Julia Stricker Coles and the fact that there was another Salmons that was living, who was about her age, I think it really is telling that, families kind of traveled. And when you think about when people migrate, they don't leave everything, their culture behind. They bring it with them. So she marries my great grandfather in 1915, a year after she leaves. So I'm wondering if like maybe, I don't know, he came down to Charlottesville to visit this Stricker Coles family. I don't know, and I don't know if I can ever find out. But I just think it's their relationships here that we normally wouldn't see as happening. And just as an aside, did they carry this agrarian tradition with them? So just as an aside, in New Jersey, in between 1890 and 1905, there were a lot of people from Virginia migrating to New Jersey. That's what this slide is saying. There seems to have been and when I looked at the block that the Browns were living on, which I should get to, there were scattered. Most of the people, I mean, it was a primarily white neighborhood, but of the people of color that were there, they were all from Virginia, which is what's very fascinating to me. And now this picture, gosh, I'm not going to be able to think about it, has nothing to do with the family. And let me just go through the slide and then I'll tell you about the picture. Maxwell Brown's father was Fernando Brown, and he was born in Jetersville in Virginia as well. And then he marries Betty Martin. To make a long story short, they had two homes. Well, he was also a founder of a Calvary Baptist church. And there's actually a book on Plainfield that mentions that. It's a book about religion in Plainfield. People write all types, all there's a book for everything. So they have a home on Webster Place in the city of Plainfield. They have 4 children, one who is my grandfather. And Fernando is listed with many professions, trash collector, ash collector, but he owns a farm in Scotch Plains. And I did a little Google search. I want to see, it's a 9-minute drive. It's 2.5 miles. So it's really close. So there is some evidence that people just didn't leave their agrarian past. They brought it with them. And, I can't think of the name. I wrote it down there in the notes of the slide, which I can't see right now. But in Scotch Plains, there was this golf course, a golf club, an African-American golf club. And African-Americans came from all over. People performed from all over. So there was a hub of African American culture going on in this point in New Jersey at a particular time. So again, I haven't really had a chance. I haven't had a chance to get up to, going to New Jersey is right outside of New York. I have to deal with a lot of stuff. So I just haven't been to. I have to get up there at one point. But it's just very interesting. And I remember my uncle telling me that his because Maxwell Brown is listed as driving a truck driver, and how he used to drive around and pick up trash for the pigs. So, maybe they had other jobs, but they kept that agrarian tradition. And that's the link I'm trying to make now by looking at farmers who are farming today in urban settings. And I know at a certain point it stopped because people everybody got disconnected from the land, not just African Americans. We all have. But what can we learn from these people? And what they did and how it built their communities. When I say that, these are some children playing golf in like the 1920s. I don't play golf, so I took a golf class, but I just think it's there was a hub of African American activity at the time. So then you have the land loss, and again, there are many reasons for this. Not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But basically, as this chart, it shows you, between 1910 and 1997, African Americans lost 90% of the farmland, and the farm in Scotch Plains was lost due to taxes. I'm sure it's a shopping mall or something like that right now. So again, when people left, they're not going to come back. You know how it is when you leave, you go someplace, you start a life. And there was a movement away from agriculture in this country. That's just the bottom line. I mean, it's not just all farmers are suffering, right, to a certain extent, struggling right now. But if all farmers are struggling, then African Americans are struggling we're struggling even more. So from 1920 to today, the average, remember, there was 14% of farmers, the first part of the 20th century. Now it's 1.3 across the nation. Okay, this is not Norman Wurzbach. This is Fannie Lou Hamer. So this is not a quote with her from her, but I just thought he's another person who writes a lot from a moral perspective about agrarianism. The authentic agrarian position cannot be rooted in nostalgia. So we can't think of it as like, oh, it's just so wonderful. There's been too much bad farming and a lot of injustice. We have to acknowledge that. To counteract these injustices, agrarianism, you have to look to the past as a source of instruction. Again, that's the innovation and the insight of people to work to correct mistakes and abuses. We have to join with scientists, ecologists, practitioners to develop regenerative farming, energy systems that could be viable for generations to come. I think people thought like that. When I think about George Washington Carver, I mean, and the extension services provided by Conley Greer, they knew this. And I didn't talk about this that much, but even in talking with current farmers, there's a spiritual connection with the land with Black agrarians. It's almost like a worship of the land. It's sacred. And again, I think this combines a little bit of African traditions also, which I also didn't talk about due to time. But all these things combined. So if the land is sacred, you take care of the land, you nurture the land, you leave it for future generations. And he said it, Norman Wurzbach said it, it is precisely those whose dreams of freedom have been denied, delayed, and derailed by structurally racist policies, and who are spearheading efforts to combat food apartheid, poverty, poor health, and can teach. Those are the ones who can teach and inspire, because they felt in their bodies and hearts the practices that are life promoting and those that are not. So we have to take a look. It's time to stop neglecting the farmer. We like to look at the scientists and the doctors and the lawyers, but we have to start looking at what Black farmers have done in the past. The thing about Zoom is this taskbar is always in the way. Okay, and this is just this. If you get a chance, I think it's online. This was it's a terrible copy. It's like I have it right here actually. This just came out, and if I look at it, I could probably tell you exactly when. In May, June 2021. And it's called Black Land Matters. So there are a lot of right now, there are a lot of people who are returning to farming. Really, and again, you don't have to be a farmer, but really looking at the land and the injustices that have been done in the past and trying to revive it. And I think yes, I will end with this quote from Bell Hooks. When Black agrarian practices are once again embraced, collective Black self-recovery can take place and the relationship to the earth renewed. When Black agrarian ancestors are remembered, the earth and our bodies once again will become sacred. Nature was the foundation of our counter-hegemonic Black subculture. Nature was the place of victory. In the natural environment, everything has its place, including humans. In that environment, everything was likely to be shaped by the reality of mystery. Their dominator culture could not wield absolute power, for in that world, nature was more powerful. These are just some lessons. So I feel like I've talked enough. I've said all this, but I want to end with, so this was when they put up the marker for Riverview Farms. That's me with my three sons. The youngest is the one on the ground. He's huge. But if it wasn't for the ancestors, we wouldn't be here. So I would like to thank, Susie, and also Farmer, and keep her in our thoughts with the passing of her father, for inviting me to give an Ivy talk. And I guess I will take questions now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Leslie. If we want to take a look at the chat, there's some questions for you
Yes, I
there.
see Dee Dee. Thank you, Dee Dee, because he did, but Virgil Wood. I'm trying to get in touch with him, but I should say hi, Dee Dee. So, but I heard he was ill. That's what I
Yeah,
was told.
I've heard he's ill as well. It's
Yeah,
probably we're still trying to get in touch with him. I'm sure he has better days than not, and his knowledge is invaluable. And he talks a lot about living off the land,
I know. I know.
particularly as a child in Yancey Mills. So, yeah, invaluable.
He's invaluable. Yeah. So I will try and reach out to him again. I think you provided me with his contact information. So let me go down. Thank you for that. Tinsley Woodfolk. Yes, that is the relative of Stanley Woodfolk, right? Sally Bell was a Hemmings. I knew, I was like, I better get this stuff right because I'm going up in front of people who know this stuff. And yes, Mariah is a descendant of Moses Gillette. Blacksmith, thank you, but I did think about it. The Link Evans brother-in-law was Jesse Sam. Okay, that must not be. Okay, great. Hey, Alice. Some people I know here, so it's good to see people. There's some people from Baltimore tuning in as well. I see Linnea has her camera on. Linnea's Baltimore, as well as Sharon Ford. Hey, Paige, I see your picture popped up. So I'm sorry if I'm missing anybody. Come on, people, questions.
Teresa, it looks like Michael Callahan had a question.
Yeah.
Where
Well,
do you?
I had a question about 5 seconds before she went into her
Oh, okay.
discussion about Carver and Washington. So thank you for that. The timing on that was pretty good.
Okay, so you don't have a question anymore.
No, I mean, I was not sure if you were going to include them, and within a matter of minutes, you did. So
They're so. I didn't include quotes from that. So that's why I included their pictures, because they're so fundamental.
Absolutely, I think
To
so.
the move. Yeah, and when I was one of those people who was, it's Du Bois, Du Bois, Du Bois, Du Bois, and but at that time, Booker T. Washington was the voice of African Americans, and although he had his issues, he was a bit of a sexist, but we have to take people with the time period they're in. I don't judge people by my standards. Let's put it that way. my standards are modern. I see somebody's hand up. Kate.
Hi, yes, thank you. This was a really great talk, and I just wish it could be longer. I know you were really breezing through everything.
Uh,
Um, and I'm sorry if you already said this, but that last quote by Bell Hooks, what was that from? I'm assuming it's from one of...
It's, it's this book called Belonging.
Okay.
And it's fascinating. Because she talks about her roots. Gosh, I can't remember where she's actually from, but she's from a rural area, and how she went to California, how she went to New York, and she always craved her agrarian roots. Just a number of interesting discussions in that book. So I would definitely say pick up a copy, and it's not one of her better known books.
Great, thank you. I think she's from Appalachia, if I'm not wrong. Like,
I think you're right. She does talk about that, dealing with the she talked. You should read the book.
Okay, great, thank you.
One
Lisa-
of the first
Hey, look.
chats came from Ms. or Mrs. Burke. You gave a wonderful information. Did you have a comment or a question for Dr. Leslie?
I just thought this was a great talk. Thank you so much for putting it on. If we want to know more information or keep in touch, is that something you could put in the chat? Or if you have everyone's contact information, will there be any post notes or post information? And hi, Alice. Hi, Steve.
I have no problem putting my email in the chat. Just don't send me prank emails.
Thank you so much. So I don't know if you saw that note, Dr. Leslie, but I'm a descendant of Rollins salmons.
See,
I need hydraulic mills.
I need to talk to you. So please reach out to me. I just put my email in the chat, and we'll set something up, okay?
Will do. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Lacey. I didn't see you there.
Hi, Teresa. Thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. And I guess my comment is, if there is a revolution to be had, how do people participate? And you made some comment about how your local government is not supporting efforts. What can we do to put pressure on that people to do the right thing?
Because I'm speaking in Charlottesville, I feel like a lot more I'm very frustrated. By, I'll just say this, there was a community health needs assessment that was done. And the top thing that came up is food in Baltimore. That's what people want. Now they're going to turn to violence. I don't understand. And again, this goes into my, democracy is really important. And I would say get involved with the community that's interested, and do some work. Do the work. Find a farm, plant stuff, just do the work. Don't rely on the policy. Don't wait for the policies. I don't think that, when you look at these individuals who are part of this community, as well as Hugh Carr and many other individuals, they didn't wait for people to give them permission. They kind of did it. I talked a little bit about the politics, but Jesse Salmons was one of those people who was involved with politics in that community. I meant to say this in my talk, but I forgot. But I would say do the work, really. Because I've done a lot of talking and people don't listen. So I'm starting to stop talking and just start, putting a seed in the ground.
I think the other really important thing to remember historically is that, particularly related to the Carr-Greer story, is that farmers, many of the local farmers that Conley Greer might have worked with, had very small farms. And what those small farms provided was food for the family, and then the adults in the household had jobs. But those jobs didn't have to provide for the food. And, Mariah, your Aunt Marcia talks about this. That is, what her family did, is that they did not have to work for food, but they worked for all the other things you need in life. And if you look at fadedcontours.org, FADED contours, Eric Ertenkopf has just done a really amazing job documenting all the African American farms in the 1940s, and that's kind of the period that kind of in between period, but you can see just how many very small farms there were in Albemarle County.
And I just want to say that again, that while right now we see small farms as very powerful, for years there's been work against small farmers, and the movement has been towards these big industrial farms. So, but anytime you have, I always say this, anytime you have something that attacks those populations that are targets, it's going to come back to the bigger population. So if African Americans are losing their land, it's not far along before everybody's going to start losing their land. So it's good to start, it's not, and when you're talking about the proportion, but small scale farming is making a comeback now, but the industrial farm has been the, after World War II, there's been a movement, and they always say, well, we can't feed everybody with small farms. We can only feed people with these big industrial farms. But it's really not about feeding everybody. It's about feeding your community. And if everybody's feeding their community, then everybody would be fed. So, but even the USDA is now, there's a movement towards small scale agriculture. I don't differentiate between urban and rural, really. It's just small scale. And I was going to say something else, but I completely forget it, went out my head. So I will, Linnea and then Karen.
Well, I think maybe you sort of answered my question, Dr. Leslie, but I wondered, is there any organized movement that Blacks and white farmers could join together to push back against industrial agriculture? I grew up in a farming area in Michigan, and my father was a milk hauler. Well, and is an all-white rural community. Most of those little farms are gone now from my childhood, and it seems to me to be a matter of economics. Not that we're trying to feed the world, but that we're trying to feed the world cheaply. Like if we have to pay more money at the farmers market, because farmers have raised that money we don't want to do it. We want to go to the grocery store and buy industrial chicken. So is there any organized movement to bring all of the small farmers together to push back?
Well, I look at it like this. There are many organizations out there. I don't think they're all united. I'm not interested in fighting back against industrial agriculture. I'm there to support small scale agriculture. That's how I look at it. So there are, and right now I think the trend is going in that direction. So I would say that's how I look at it. I don't think that I have a chance sometimes against industrial agriculture, but if more people start buying local, supporting regional food systems, and I think that's what Lacey was kind of talking about. If governments aren't seeing the significance of this, then, what do you do? But I think that, again, I am not the type of person, I hate to say I don't, protest or anything like that. But my thing is to support the small scale farmer and let the industrial agriculturalists do what they want. I think they'll eventually fall apart anyway on their own. I really do. So, yeah, I hope I answered your question, but I'll think about it, and I'll think about some more organizations. I know that I know people who have started agricultural organizations, especially Black farmers, but I don't know of any united front. Let's put it that way. And the other thing I want to say is that this topic has the potential to unite, and because it's very, is it bipartisan? It's about food. So I think if you approach, the whole argument of the environment through food, I think more people will listen. Even those populations who don't have time to think about carbon emissions and all, if you talk about, healthy food and cheaper food, because right now, to be honest with you, it's about the same price at the farmer's market than at the grocery store. It used to be the farmer's market was more expensive, but the prices of food are so high now. I mean, this is really the time to really push for something like that. Karen?
Wait,
Yeah,
hold on.
thank you.
Hold on, Karen. Sorry. I'd just like to encourage folks. We did have Dr. John Boyd do an Ivy Talk in February of 2022, and that's on our Ivy Talk page. So I encourage all of you to watch that if you weren't able to see that.
What was
He
it on?
talks African American farmers. He started the African American farmers unit who's suing the USDA for
Okay, yeah, that's a
inappropriate
big thing.
practices. Yeah,
Yeah,
so please
so
check that out. Sorry, Karen.
please do. Yes, you have to plug to get 1,000 more views. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. There's another hinge to conservation easement projects as well that are working now with farmers very intensively, usually with multi-agency groups. That's another place where there can be cooperation because people have adjoining properties, but that was not the comment I wanted to make. I wanted to ask you first something specific and then something big picture, but the specific one is, are you aware of Atia Wells and the Bliss Gardens project in Baltimore?
Yes, I do know that. I do know Bliss Gardens. It's actually not far from my house.
Yeah, I put it in comments. It's so inspiring. I don't know what they're operating at now, but it was visionary. I mean, they found this 10-acre, little tiny bit of land shoehorned. And as I recall, they were like 30 miles away from decent food at the minimum. It was on the west side of Baltimore, I
Also,
think.
then they've moved because they're in East Baltimore now.
No, they're in East Baltimore. You've got
Right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't
And
say 30 miles, but
it was some really, really terrible statistic. And so they started getting to know their neighbors and bringing them things they were growing. So part of it is a nature walk and part of it is farm. And they invited the neighborhood by bringing them food and saying, do you want some food? Do you want some of our vegetables? And that's how they started bringing people in. But it's like small scale, right? But
yeah, they're all there. But you could do a lot in a little space.
So amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you could do a lot in a little space, but the bottom line is that, and I've learned this recently. I mean, the bottom line of agriculture is production.
Mm-hmm.
How much you produce. But according to the USDA, in order to be considered a farmer, you just have to sell or potentially sell $1,000 worth of produce or agricultural products.
Like a year.
And you don't actually have to make the money. You can say, but I give the food away. So it's kind of very open, and that's a good thing because then more people are able to get funding if they have to sit down and write a complicated USDA grant. So, but you can produce, and that's the idea. Okay, if you're doing urban agriculture and you have a small space, how do you innovate to grow more to feed your community? And it goes directly to that concept, that food insecurity, which is a problem. People would call it food apartheid. And you have an organization down there. Again, it's evening time, and I forget things because I can't remember the guy's name who used to be there at Cultivate Charlottesville. But I think they're doing some of that work down there. And there was a guy who was one of the head farmer, but I think he's he's doing other things. When I said he retired, he said, well, I don't know if I retired, but I want to do other things. So I actually interviewed him. I can't
interrupted, by the pandemic and
yeah, well, all the work that's been the pandemic has shown people are still in need of free food boxes. The pandemic showed that there's an issue with people getting food and fresh food. Fresh produce. We eat a lot of junk. And again, being in public health, what I've noticed is public health has become medical. So it's just about getting people to the clinic to give them pharmaceuticals.
The antidotes.
The antidotes, as opposed to, it's one thing to say, oh, well, you're developing diabetes, you better eat better. But if the grocery store is 20 miles away and you don't have a car, well, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even say it's 20 miles away. So this is Baltimore, maybe the grocery store is 5 miles away. But if you don't have a car, that's far because the public transportation system is terrible. So what if, I had my garden this summer, I didn't buy any produce. right now I have to start soon. I'll have to start buying peppers because I still have stewed tomatoes in there. And then I got a dehydrator and I went crazy with the dehydrator. So I have like all types of herbs and stuff from the summer. So it really does, it supplements your, don't let me get some chickens and then I'll have eggs. I don't think my neighbors would like that. But but I mean, there's you don't need much space. I had too much stuff. I was giving stuff away because it was just too much. I think I brought some stuff by you, Linnea. It was just I just had too much. So so if everybody's doing that, but my neighbors do. It's like both my neighbors, we all actually share a guy who comes around and works our soil and everything. So we're very happy for him. But across the street, they have stuff growing. It's like, it's amazing to see people come by and say, hey, what are you growing? This is what I have, especially when everybody's trying to get out in the spring. But it does create this sense of togetherness. And sometimes I'll go out back and I saw, let's say, an acorn squash, which I didn't have, just sitting on my deck. I was like, wow, it does create that. And to be back there and see the bees, the groundhogs, the rabbits. But I think that, what is it? Somebody said, plant an extra row. So don't worry about them. Just plant an extra row of corn for the animals so that they get to eat too. Everybody has to eat. Although it's not pleasant when a groundhog eats your stuff, but just seeing how it brings wildlife is just sitting out back just listening to the birds is just amazing. And you really are in tune with you can really get lost. So I was talking to one of the farmers. He gave an Ivy talk and we were talking about music and how I'm going to look at the time, how when you look at jazz, I mean, this conversation gave me goosebumps. A lot of like Miles Davis's father was a farmer and he used to mimic the birds and that's how he got his sound. And this guy, he was like Stevie Wonder was blind, but he had a whole album on the secret life of plants. So it's like there was a time where we were in touch with nature and that came out in the music. That spiritual essence came out in the music. And to a certain extent, well, you hear the music today. It's influenced by an environment that's not nature induced. Let's put it that. Not that I have a problem with it. Not like I'm not, saying it's just bad. But I think that, when you look at Bell Hooks in her book talks about the relationship of Black men to nature. And that's why I mentioned that George Washington Carver was very tall, but he was supposed to be very gentle. And taking care of plants and taking care of animals. It's something that I think I would like to see a revival, not the way it was, but let's say greening our spaces and inviting everybody in. And I do think that, whether you say African Americans, that's what I study, but I think BIPOC populations again, and I kind of skipped over that slide. They need to take the lead because they have the history behind it. And I'm going to end there. I could talk forever.
Well, I just had one big picture question because of this august group that's all in the same Zoom room. And
very quickly, Karen, very quickly.
Which was that I've been surveying things, surveying online and whatever up and down the East Coast to find other unique properties that are still in existence, like the Carr farm, like Riverview Farm. And I really haven't found many. I've found maybe one or two, but they're not still as intact as Riverview Farm. And I wondered if anybody in this group knows of other properties. And I see that Tammy is asking about a group in Harford County, Maryland, and saving a farm there. But there are farm lands and families sometimes still own them, but they're not open to the public. They're not historical. And this is one of the things I always say about Riverview Farm is that its intactness is unique, probably up and down the East Coast, but I don't really know if that's accurate.
I can't answer.
Well, Teresa, you and I went to the Carter farm in Orange County.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The Carter. So Michael, he gave an Ivy talk, That's the farmer I was talking to about music. But so Michael Carter has a 5-generation farm. That's kind of operational still. Maybe he's in his late 30s, early 40s.
And that goes way back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
goes.
but
It doesn't create.
Operational, I am asking about a historical property more than an operational farm. I know those still exist, but they're not places that invite people on to hear the story, you know.
Well, the Carters do
Yeah.
on programmatically. I mean, you can't just go like
So we went for a Juneteenth.
yeah, a Juneteenth.
Then yeah, it was they had they had some good fried fish, and I remember his father was like, "You can't leave; you have to eat the fish." And we
No,
stayed.
you wouldn't let us leave. Yeah.
And it was really so I would, and that's how, yeah, I would say but no, in terms of saying that there's still the homestead, I think we're very, it's something I'm very proud of, and I think also the work of Ivy Creek to
Exactly.
to preserve it and to continue to consistently bring in money and kind of like reinvent itself in what it's doing now. I think that, what is it, Babs Cohen, who initially bought the property. I think we have to really
Absolutely.
celebrate her for having that foresight that this and anybody that hasn't been there, I would encourage you to just visit, because it's really incredible.
And on that note, thank you, Dr. Leslie. This was outstanding. Thank you all for your questions and comments. Thank you, Mariah Payne, for your jumping in and facilitating this evening. As Dr. Leslie has said, we are a small nonprofit with a teeny staff, but excellent volunteers. Many of you are tried and true volunteers on this Ivy Talk. So if you like what we're doing, please consider, in the season of giving a monetary donation if you can at this time, to support programs like this. This year we've had over 200 programs for people of all ages, and when we offer those free at no charge, and we do that through the generosity of people like you on this Ivy Talk. So it's recorded. We're going to post it in the next few days on our YouTube page, as Mariah said. So I wish you all a healthy and safe holiday season, and looking forward to seeing you in 2024. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good evening.
You too.